Try to imagine taking this picture, dragging yourself through the thick growth, lifting the camera to your eye, and capturing a lost city with one click. One click that locks you in as a legend and a lightning rod. One click of a button that leads to some calling you a thief, a liar, and even a murderer. You're looking at the first photographs ever taken of Machu Picchu, a city abandoned by its creators, a city forgotten by history, a city lost in the clouds. Millions of cameras would follow, but one was the first. These rarely seen photos were taken by a man who's often credited with discovering Machu Picchu, even though people were already living there when he crested that mountaintop deep in the uncharted Andes. A college professor and armchair archaeologist some have called the real-life Indiana Jones. But was there something he was hiding? Was there a vital clue he tried to cover up? And what was this place? Who built it? And why? Where did they go? And how did they manage this impossible feat on the top of a mountain? Was it aliens? No. This isn't the kind of video where I point the camera at my face and pretend those who built this towering achievement didn't know what they were doing. I didn't fly all the way to Peru and spend 9 months of research and editing this story just to make things up. This is a tale of colonization, of conversion, of exploitation, a tale of liberation, a tale of obsession, a tale of devastation, a tale of one man and his camera, a man who cast away his birthright and plunged into the unknown, a man who's credited with making one of the most significant archaeological finds in the history of human civilization, a man who may be the first to ever document such a discovery with photography. But was he an intrepid explorer who shined a spotlight on a forgotten empire? Or was he a con man, a charlatan, a thieving prototype of a social media influencer who plundered the treasures of a continent? We'll take a look at his own private letters, including some never before seen outside the archives of a museum. We'll find out why some called him a criminal, and we'll put him on trial ourselves, so you can be his judge. This is a tale of discovery. Our story begins at the beginning, because this tale only comes into focus if you understand the man behind the camera. Our story begins not in the jungles of Peru, but here in the year 1875, in what was then known as the Kingdom of Hawaii, on the shores of Oahu. Our story begins with a boy named Hiram Bingham, and for him, in many ways, this island paradise may as well have been Alcatraz. This is his father, Hiram Bingham, and this is his grandfather, Hiram Bingham, making that boy Hiram Bingham III. And Hiram Bingham I was, let's just say, notorious. He was a Protestant missionary bent on converting the natives to his brand of Christianity. A real fire and brimstone preacher here on the islands forged by volcanoes. He tried to wipe out their culture. He's even credited with converting the Queen. Some mockingly called him King Bingham. Hiram II was also a missionary, though less successful. But he still ruled Hiram III with an iron fist, or a wooden stick. Here in Honolulu, young Hiram was drowning under the domineering shadow of his family legacy, carrying those 3 numerals around his neck everywhere he went. His own son would later write, "All his life, Bingham struggled with a sense of inadequacy." He grew up poor and was often teased at school, the same school later attended by a guy you might have heard of, Barack Obama. Hiram dreamed of escape. At one point, he bought a ticket to New York City after cashing in his college fund, only caught at the docks because the ship was delayed. Liberation had to wait. Hiram could only find escape within, hiding amid the books of the city library and venturing out on hikes in the mountains of Hawaii. Until finally, his time came. He enrolls at a boarding school near Boston, then lands at Yale. Yes, the Yale, just like his father before him. Now a towering 6'4" tall, he took part in elite pastimes like racing sailboats, but he was still seen as a penniless student and never quite broke through into the clubs of the rich. He planned to graduate and become a missionary in China, but he also spent time doing things he wasn't supposed to do. He learned how to play cards and to dance, unholy activities forbidden by his family. After graduation, Hiram was torn between two worlds. Lost, he reluctantly returned to Hawaii, a place also torn between worlds. The monarchy had been overthrown, the islands now annexed by the United States. Hiram moves back in with his parents and becomes a pastor. He only lasts a few months. Because then, a compass washes up on shore. A young woman arrives with her family, a young woman he'd met a few years earlier at Yale. Hiram was smitten. Her name was Alfreda Mitchell, an heir to the Tiffany fortune. The Tiffany fortune. Diamonds, jewelry, sterling silver spoons. Now, you might think Hiram was a gold digger, but as you'll see, that's about as far from the truth as you could imagine. And there's a snag. Her parents simply don't approve. That old inadequacy struck again. Hiram would have to prove himself. He got a white-collar job working on the sugarcane fields and made enough money to move to San Francisco. He enrolls at Berkeley and discovers an interest in history. He writes his thesis on American influence in Hawaii. And in the new century, a new Hiram. November of the year 1900, he and Alfreda get married. I guess striking out on his own must have impressed her parents. And now, a pivotal turn. Hiram goes to Harvard for his PhD and decides if he really wants to forge a new path, if he really wants to make a name for himself, he needs to study Latin American history, something largely overlooked in the US and Europe. It would be something of his own, something only for Hiram Bingham. He had a hunger for achievement, something that would eventually come at a cost. And Hiram focuses on one particular person, Simón Bolívar. Now, if you don't know who that is, he was a man from Venezuela who led 6 different countries in Central and South America to independence from Spain in the early 1800s. He chased the conquerors out and helped give freedom to the people of Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. I want you to take a minute and think about this. Hiram grew up in a family that helped topple a kingdom with religion. But instead of identifying with the conquerors, he's identifying with the liberator. He finishes up at Harvard and his family grows. He wants a teaching job at Yale, but they're not really interested in Latin American history. The best he can do is landing a tutoring gig at Princeton. Hiram's inadequacy bubbled to the surface. This wasn't exactly striking out on his own. He and his family lived a pampered life, and Princeton was a dead-end job. His son later wrote, his marriage to Alfreda Mitchell had made his liberation possible, but he never could be sure how much his love was for herself and how much for her family's money. He could have stayed put. He could have chosen the easy life, but that wasn't Hiram Bingham. And so, in the year 1906, Hiram headed south. His goal was to travel through Venezuela and Colombia. Frustrated by a lack of material on Simón Bolívar, part of his purpose was to find books on the man and to walk in his footsteps. Perhaps Bolívar, often called the Liberator, would liberate Hiram in a way the Tiffany money never could. Perhaps by writing a biography on Bolívar, the world would have to acknowledge the greatness of both of them. And this wouldn't involve taking a boat from site to site. Hiram would travel over land, a true adventure. He wrote to his father, I feel the Bingham blood stirring in my veins as I start for little-known regions, as nearly all my Bingham ancestors for 10 generations have done before me. Accompanied by a few companions and a camera, Hiram does exactly what he set out to do. Traveling by horse and mule, trudging through the dirt, about as far from the Tiffany wealth as you could imagine. He later published a book that often reads more like a modern travel blog. Yes, he devotes time to discussing Bolivar, but he also gives detailed descriptions of his day-to-day life. He tells us of being awoken by pigs scratching themselves on his hammock. He talks of hunting iguanas, only to find no one will agree to prepare them as food. He speaks of the small towns, the big cities, the people, the picnics, the views. Hiram is every bit as smitten as he was with Alfreda. He returns home with the South American trade winds of good fortune at his back. He returns home, a changed man. And that change would soon lead him into a mystery, one guarded by the mountains. Later, when named in the book Who's Who in America, Hiram wouldn't list himself as a teacher or an author or an academic. He'd list himself as an explorer. And good news greeted his return. Yale granted him a job as a lecturer on South America. Not a full-blown professor, but he was on the right track. Latin America was starting to become, well, trendy. The United States was increasingly expansionist, and gaining a foothold south of the equator was vital. And if you're a gambler, like Hiram probably was, I'd be betting on him. Because soon he's asked to be one of the delegates to the Pan-American Scientific Congress in Santiago, Chile. This meant he went to Washington to meet Teddy Roosevelt. Say it with me, yes, the Teddy Roosevelt. President of the United States, and the man behind a lot of this new interest in South America. Before becoming president, he'd pushed for that takeover of Hawaii, and now he was looking south. I mean, he'd just sent the Navy down to Panama a few years earlier to help them break away from Colombia, and was in the midst of building a modest little engineering project called the Panama Canal. But you should know Hiram Bingham by now. He certainly wasn't going to go all the way to Santiago just to shake a few hands at a conference. This was an opportunity to keep making his name as an explorer. He planned to trace the old Spanish trade routes through Argentina and Bolivia before heading to Peru. In the middle, he'd represent Yale at that conference. This wasn't quite as off the grid as his last trip, as Hiram would mainly be taking trains instead of bouncing on the back of a mule. But it wasn't exactly the lap of luxury either. Just to give you an example of this, Hiram has an encounter with a couple of Americans in Bolivia he describes as rough-looking. They warn him about highway robbers who'd been forced out of the US and pursued by detectives. Hiram later learned that these two men were in fact bandits themselves. It's believed they were none other than Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabout, better known as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Thankfully, Hiram wasn't robbed. I'm sure Butch and Sundance would have taken his camera, and then we would have been robbed of seeing all these pictures. I think my favorite is when he just publishes this one with the caption, "A friendly llama baby." But he does still have that conference to worry about. While there, he gives a presentation where he speaks of what he's learned about South America. And we see a bit of that other Hiram Bingham, the one who identified with the conquerors. His speech is basically on why the US succeeded in coming together, and the old Spanish colonies didn't. He talks of the locals as a backwards race, and when he later wrote of the Spaniards, he said, "Only a vigorous and rising nation could have accomplished the great work of exploring, conquering, and colonizing America, which was done at that time." Which, okay, let's just call it what it is, it's pretty racist. And look, I get it, you want to like Hiram. I want to like him too. He tossed away the religious life he was supposed to have. He found the ultimate meal ticket with a Tiffany fortune, but still vaulted into this unfamiliar existence, just in the hopes of writing his own story. And he's doing it. It's working. His gambles are paying off, but he's also a racist. There's no excuse, but I think what we have to understand is that most everyone like him was racist back then. There was this thing called scientific racism, which has since been completely debunked. The Westerners were at the top, and everyone else, Africans, Native South Americans, even Hawaiians, well, they were at the bottom. People were looking for explanations on why the Europeans managed to advance and steamroll all these other cultures, so they landed on this reasoning that they must be genetically superior. But all of Hiram's preconceptions were about to be torn to shreds, and we're about to find out the truth, which has nothing to do with genetics. His original plan was to take a ship from Santiago de Lima, the capital of Peru. But in Bolivia, he'd been shown a book full of drawings like this one. A book by an American named E.G. Squire, who'd explored Peru about 50 years earlier. A book that filled him with wonder, ruins and rope bridges and all these wondrous sights he just had to see for himself. These sketches whispered a quiet invitation towards a destiny that nearly broke the very name he was trying to build. So, change of plans. He hops a train through Peru and ends up in Cusco, once the gleaming capital of the Inca, the largest empire in the entire Western Hemisphere. Until now, for all his interest in Latin America, Hiram didn't know much or really care about what happened before the Spanish came. Remember, the natives were primitive, uncivilized, backwards. He sees the remains of the Coricancha, the Inca Temple of the Sun. He gazes upon the massive monolithic blocks of Sacsayhuaman, fit perfectly together without even a hint of mortar. He writes, "What remains is the most impressive spectacle of man's handiwork that I have ever seen in America. Photographs absolutely fail to do it justice." Hiram Bingham's eyes were now open. There's no way a backwards race could have accomplished this. And because of these new revelations, after leaving Cusco, he winds up taking yet another detour. He meets a man who tells him of a place called Choqquequirao, meaning cradle of gold. He wants to take Hiram there. Some believed the city was filled with treasure and was possibly even the mysterious lost city of Vilcabamba. I want you to remember that name, Vilcabamba, because it's absolutely pivotal in what's to come. What was this place? In order to answer that question, we'll need to learn about those who built it. Knowledge Hiram Bingham himself was just now beginning to uncover. He thought he was searching for a lost city. What he didn't realize was that he was stepping right into the final chapter of a story thousands of years in the making. In order to understand Vilcabamba, we have to understand the world that created it. Our story begins at the very beginning, thousands of years ago, on the dry coastal deserts and steep mountainous terrain of the Andes. Civilizations came and went. The Corral, peaceful builders of pyramids, the oldest civilization in the Americas. The Paracas, masters of irrigation with elaborate burial practices which you can see in this museum, wrapping the dead in bundles of textiles in a fetal position, returning them to the earth. The Nazca, creators of complex ceramics, and of course what's known as the Nazca lines, only truly visible from hills or directly above. Designs reflected in their ceramics and likely used as ceremonial paths as the people prayed for water. The Wari, builders of a mountain empire. They terraformed the very earth itself. Architects of terraces, granting the ability to grow crops here and thrive amid the mountains. These and others grew and fell over the centuries, each building on the legacy of the past. In a sense, the Inca brought it all together. They spread, they expanded, sometimes through conquest and often simply by inviting neighboring groups to join them and share in this legacy. They built roads linking it all together, and what they left behind is everywhere. Moray, the laboratory of the Inca, a place where walking downhill greets you with an entirely different climate. This is where they tested which crops would grow best at different altitudes. Maras, a sprawling salt mine resting 10,000 feet above the sea. Each pond filled with salty water from an underground spring, and salt is harvested as the water evaporates. Like many sites, it was here before the Inca and continued to live on. It's still in use today. On the hillsides of what's known as the Sacred Valley, ruins of Inca terraces stretch up to the sky, showing just how far their abilities reached. And they accomplished all of this without the advantages other civilizations had around the world. There were no horses to ride, no cattle to help plow fields. They didn't even have the wheel, not because they didn't understand the concept, but because there's really no point here in the mountains. Hemmed in by an ocean on one side and a dense rainforest on the other, the Inca made their own advantages. Despite facing so many challenges, the Inca persisted. They flourished until one day, they started getting sick. Far to the north, the Spanish had arrived in the Americas, and before they even knew who the Inca were, the diseases they carried stretched south. The local people simply had no immunity. In some areas, as much as 90% were wiped out. The king of the Inca got sick and died, probably of smallpox. So did his heir. This sparked a civil war between two sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Atahualpa came out on top, but at great cost to the Inca people. And then they came, the Spanish. They were led by an abomination of a man, Francisco Pizarro. After failed expeditions south, he lands in the empire of the Inca, consumed with a desire for gold. Other natives had told him this was the place to find it. After an arduous trek through the mountains, they find Atahualpa, who just defeated his brother and taken the crown. Pizarro says he'll help Atahualpa put down those who were loyal to his brother. The two agree to meet the following day in the square of the city of Cajamarca, and Atahualpa had nothing to fear. After all, he was surrounded by tens of thousands of Inca soldiers, and Pizarro only had, get this, 168. But he laid a trap. Atahualpa left most of his men behind, and Pizarro flung open the very gates of hell. Guns firing, cannons bursting, his men exploded onto the square. The Inca were helpless against cavalry and men encased in thick steel. The Spanish weren't genetically superior. They were just the beneficiaries of advantages the Inca didn't have. It was a slaughter. Amid the chaos, Pizarro pulls Atahualpa from his throne, just as his cousin Cortez did with the Aztecs in Mexico. Pizarro took the king of the Inca hostage, throwing the entire empire into disarray. He was held here in what's known as the ransom room. Atahualpa promises to fill the room with gold and 2 more of the same size with silver. He sends people out to fulfill that promise, mainly using the opportunity to strip the wealth of nobles who were loyal to his brother. He fulfills his end of the bargain, but Pizarro doesn't. He holds a mock trial and sentences Atahualpa to be burned at the stake, in exchange for avoiding a fate he believed would doom his very soul. Atahualpa agrees to convert to Christianity. He's baptized, given the name Francisco Atahualpa in honor of Francisco Pizarro, and is promptly strangled. Pizarro installs a puppet dictator. He soon dies and is succeeded by Manco Yupanqui, brother of Atahualpa. But he won't exactly go along with the plans of the Spaniards. Eventually he escapes. He gathers a resistance. He forms an army. For 10 long months, Manco lays siege to the city of Cusco from Sacsayhuaman before he's forced to retreat. He faces the Spanish again, here at Ollantaytambo. Manco uses the Inca knowledge of water to reroute the irrigation systems, flooding the valley and forcing Pizarro's men back. Manco decided Ollantaytambo is too close to Cusco and leads his people away to the town of Vitcos. They're attacked, and they flee, setting up an all-new capital. There they held out for decades, creating what we call the Neo-Inca state. When they're finally defeated, Manco's capital city passes into memory. The name of that city? Vilcabamba. These stories were surely swimming through the mind of Hiram Bingham on his treacherous trek. He followed a group along steep cliffs and through torrential rain, scaling mountains on the way to Choqquequirau. He'd been warned about this trip. One man supposedly told him going to Choqquequirau nearly killed him, and he lost a mule. Exactly the kind of adventure Hiram was looking for. Much like Machu Picchu, Choqquequirau is perched high in the mountains. Hiram arrived safely and found that much of it was covered in growth, though excavation was underway. As I said, some believed this place was Vilcabamba, and legend said that Manco had brought the last of the Inca gold with him. Hiram writes that dynamite had also been used in various likely spots where treasure might have been buried. Of course, this wasn't Vilcabamba, and there was no gold. Hiram takes detailed measurements and has drawings made, but decides Vilcabamba must be elsewhere, chalking the error up to a mistake in the words chosen by a Spanish friar, who'd written days instead of leagues when speaking of Vilcabamba's location. When he heads back home to Yale and to his family, Hiram has an idea of where the real Vilcabamba may be. And as much as I'd like to tell you he was hell-bent on finding it, the truth is Hiram didn't care about gold. All he really cared about was exploring. His son later wrote, "Danger and hardship helped him prove himself, and his expeditions did much for his self-assurance. His body was home, but his heart still rested south. So he plans an expedition, a major expedition, one that would change his life forever. He immediately starts looking for sponsors. How about a 3-year archaeological study of Mayan ruins in Central and South America? Or how about exploring a river in Ecuador down into the Amazon? Or how about a journey deep into the Amazon itself? Hiram couldn't get anyone to bite. So in a sense, he just does it himself. An old college classmate from Yale agrees to fund the cost of a geologist on an expedition back to Peru, the goal being a geographic survey. Hiram would seek out Inca ruins north of Cusco, including Vilcabamba. He'd also climb and measure what he thought was the highest mountain in South America, and he'd conduct that geographical survey between the two areas. So he starts writing letters, a lot of letters, often to people he knew from Yale, asking for donations, recruiting team members, and requesting supplies. Here, he thanks someone for the $500. Here, he thanks someone for the $100. And here, he says thanks for the $25, but just so you know, the smallest gift has been $100, so maybe you should give more, or ask that your name isn't listed anywhere so you're not embarrassed. And while he's understandably reluctant to ask his wife's parents for money, he does write a lengthy letter to Aunt Louise. That's Louise Tiffany at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. He says their goal is to explore a portion of Peru which is not at present known to science, and asks for $1,000. Here's a letter from someone saying a guy can't join the team because $1,800 to pay his own way is just too much. Here's one from someone at Yale saying, "Sorry, my dad won't let me go." As for himself, Hiram actually sells some inherited land in Hawaii, determined to pay his own way. And in true Instagram influencer fashion, Hiram asks for free stuff in exchange for exposure. This saddle company says they don't usually give discounts, but they'll cut 15% off the price. Colt Firearms says, "No, we don't give away free guns because if we give you free guns, then everyone's gonna want free guns." Hiram responds and says, "Well, I wouldn't have asked for guns, except Winchester already offered me guns, so I thought maybe you'd want to get in on that." That does seem to be true. And it is worth mentioning that Winchester did recommend he get in touch with Colt. The point is, Hiram was nothing if not resourceful, and in many cases, it worked. He asks for specialized watches that can handle extreme temperatures. Then the company writes back saying, "Sure, we'll loan you some watches, just tell us how they work so we can use it in advertising." He asks a map company in London for some high-end maps of Peru, saying in return he'll give them whatever maps his team is able to make, and they happily agreed to the trade. Hiram buys some beds and other camping equipment, and this company actually volunteers to give him free axes and knives just because they're interested in helping. I think part of the reason Hiram has success with discounts and free stuff is because this is an official trip endorsed by Yale, called the Yale Scientific Expedition to Peru. They aren't paying for it, but they are allowing leaves of absence for team members and paying their normal salaries. Hiram buys a bunch of the team's equipment from Abercrombie & Fitch. Yes, the Abercrombie & Fitch, known at the time for being an outfitter for outdoorsmen, and they'd actually helped out Teddy Roosevelt. And of course, Hiram does convince them to give him a discount. But I'm not telling you all this just to show how much effort Hiram put into planning this expedition, nor am I just telling you to build the anticipation. All these requests culminate in one single letter, the letter that may be the only reason Hiram's big discovery happens at all. He writes a man named George Eastman, explaining that he's getting help from Yale, help from Winchester, and help from the Waltham Watch Company. Now, George Eastman was the founder of a little company called Eastman Kodak, a company that was helping popularize photography all over the world. And Eastman himself actually responds, saying, "I got your letter asking for a favor. What are you looking for to take on your trip?" Of course, Hiram knows a bit about photography himself, and his request is rather modest. He asks for one camera, a leather case, film cartridges, and a tripod, among a few other accessories. And most notably, he asks for suggestions. Hiram follows up by saying that the team's geologist suggests adding a camera that uses plates instead of film. He mentions his previous trips to South America and says he took 900 plate photographs, but they deteriorated. Eastman's response refers to an earlier telegram and says, "Think we can furnish part or all of your outfit without charge." Words that surely thrilled our thrifty professor. He goes on to tell Hiram not to take plates and to only use film because of the humid environment. Then he suggests developing the film in the field himself, using Kodak's tank developers. And this part is key. In a way, George Eastman's tips and suggestions set up the entire expedition for success, and are what make Hiram famous. Eastman even sends extra developing equipment and says every member of the team should run tests before they go. And he sends Hiram a book, charmingly called How to Make Good Pictures. 173 pages. Not just information on how to develop film, but about lenses and lighting and exposure and how to take pretty much any type of photograph you could imagine. Of course, Eastman has an interest here. He wants someone testing his products in an extreme environment so he can use it in advertising. But he also takes a real interest in ensuring Hiram has the best stuff possible. They go back and forth, nailing down the best tools for the job, resulting in far more than what Hiram initially asked for. And before the team sets off, there's a little fanfare. Buried in the back of a New York newspaper called The Sun is a short article entitled "Hopes to Find Lost Cities," which kind of gives you an idea of what the press was interested in. Hiram himself is quoted, listing who's going on this 6-month trip. A geologist and geographer, a naturalist and collector, a surgeon, a topographer and engineer, and an assistant archaeologist. He mentions Choqquequirao and says, "We hope on this expedition to find others of these cities." Of course, the Inca cities on the plateau have been known, but they're fortified cities they were accustomed to hang in almost inaccessible spots on mountainsides, and it has only lately been possible to get near them. And in a bit of foreshadowing, he says, "Of course, we are not going with any idea of hunting buried treasure. Should anything be found in that line, it would become the property of the Peruvian government." And so, in the summer of 1911, the team set sail from New York City with bookings on steamships owned by the United Fruit Company. Yes, the United Fruit Company. Well, we now know them as Chiquita. The Yale scientific expedition to Peru is on its way. Hiram's hopes are high, but what's about to happen is beyond anything he could have imagined. The team members didn't all arrive in Peru at once. Some took a detour in Panama to check out the construction of a canal. But Hiram went straight to Lima, taking the time to finalize arrangements and gather more clues. One of those clues pointed to ruins near a place called Mandor Pampa. The team gathered in Cusco before splitting up into 3 different groups. Hiram's group would mainly consist of himself, his good friend and the group's naturalist Harry Foote, and surgeon William Irving. They planned to head in the direction where Hiram believes Vilcabamba awaits. While everyone's still getting ready, Hiram finds some old bones buried in a glacial deposit. Here's Harry Foote pointing at the spot where they were found. The team thinks they may be as much as 40,000 years old. Hiram believes they're already rewriting history, but they later turn out to be not quite as relevant as he'd hoped. And as the expedition gets underway, the prefect of Cusco sends a member of the military with Hiram, a guy named Sergeant Carrasco. You see, the region wasn't entirely safe. Colonial interests were running rubber plantations. They'd captured and enslaved many indigenous people in Peru and surrounding countries to do their bidding. There'd been a recent uprising, so Hiram accepted the offer of an armed escort. In the nearby town of Urubamba, Hiram gets yet another clue. The ruins near Mandor Pampa may be called Huayna Picchu. He's given specific instructions on where to look and who to look for. But then, disaster strikes. Just after the group split up, Hiram hears that a local boy drowned. while in the employ of one of his other teams. The boy was crossing the Urubamba River when he fell. Hiram's notes say, "The boy had been told not to cross, but disobeyed orders." But another version of the story is that they actually sent him across first. Either way, Hiram would never publicly write about or mention what happened. Some have pointed to this as an example of how the locals just weren't considered as important as the foreigners. The theme we'll see emerge yet again very soon. Hiram continues on into the Sacred Valley. They stop in Ollantaytambo, the very spot where Manco had flooded the valley and pushed the Spanish back. Hiram takes photographs and records observations on the way, reflecting on how the valley reminds him of his wanderings in Hawaii. The team and their mules soon arrive at the area known as Mondor Pampa, where they set up camp. Hiram finds a tavern owner and farmer named Melchor Arteaga, the person he was told to ask about nearby ruins. Hiram scribbles furiously in his notebook as Arteaga says, yes, there are ruins on a mountain called Huayna Picchu, and others on a ridge called Machu Picchu. The following morning, July 24th, 1911, a chill is in the air as dawn breaks, and a fine drizzle falls from the sky. Hiram wants Arteaga to lead him up to the ruins. He later writes, Arteaga shivered and seemed inclined to stay in his hut. I offered to pay him well if he would show me the ruins. He demurred and said it was too hard of a climb for such a wet day. But when he found that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage in this vicinity, he finally agreed to go. When asked just where the ruins were, he pointed straight up to the top of the mountain. No one supposed that they would be particularly interesting, and no one cared to go with me. Now, obviously this isn't entirely true. Hiram had been told there were ruins here, so obviously someone did think they'd be interesting. But it is true that the other team members stayed behind. Hiram says Harry Foote wanted to go and look for butterflies, and William Irving said he had to do some laundry. It would only be Hiram and Sergeant Carrasco following Arteaga up the mountain. Their first obstacle was the Urubamba River. This is a picture Hiram took of Arteaga crossing on what passed as a bridge. And you'd have to think Hiram was more than a little nervous after what happened to that boy. He writes, Arteaga and the sergeant took off their shoes and crept gingerly across, using their somewhat prehensile toes to keep from slipping. I am frank to confess that I got down on my hands and knees and crawled across 6 inches at a time. The main obstacle was even more challenging, the mountain itself. Hiram took this picture near the base, wondering if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. As they climbed, the temperature rose. The humidity grew thicker. After all, they call this jungle the Cloud Forest for a reason. Arteaga warns his 2 followers of snakes, specifically vipers known to make this area their home. Hiram struggles to keep up. He writes, a good part of the distance we went on all 4s, sometimes holding on by our fingernails. Completely spent, the men dragged themselves up to the top just after noon. Hiram gazes down at the valley floor some 2,000 feet below. Arteaga leads them to a house. Not this house. Apparently Hiram didn't take a picture of the actual one. Some local farmers lived here, growing crops on nearby Inca terraces. They'd moved here to escape the watchful eye of the government and the turbulent times they lived in. Hiram gratefully guzzles down some water they offered. Arteaga says he'd already seen the ruins and doesn't care to go, so the farmers give Hiram and Sergeant Carrasco a guide. A barefoot 8-year-old boy we only know as Pablito. They don't get far before they see the terraces, many littered with the remains of trees the farmers had cut down to grow their crops. Hiram is unimpressed. He'd seen this sort of thing before and begins to wonder if he should have just stayed at the bottom and helped Harry Foote look for butterflies. But soon, everything changes. The following moments are the major turning point in Hiram Bingham's entire life. He follows Pablito through some thick brush and is greeted by Machu Picchu itself. A city hovering in the clouds, a city carved right into the mountain like the very earth itself had whispered a dream into stone. He spent years chasing legends, and had walked right into one. In a sense, it had been waiting patiently for someone just like him to come along, someone to tell the world of its grandeur. Everything had led up to this, leaving behind his life as a missionary, burying his head in history books, tracking the life of Simón Bolívar, learning of the Inca, planning an expedition, tracking clues, securing all the camera equipment he could dream of. It all brought him right here, to this very spot. Hiram sets up his tripod and begins documenting what he sees. Suddenly I found myself confronted with the walls of ruined houses built of the finest quality of Inca stonework. It was hard to see them, for they were partly covered with trees and moss, the growth of centuries. But in the dense shadow, hiding in bamboo thickets and tangled vines, appeared here and there walls of white granite ashlars, carefully cut and exquisitely fitted together. Machu Picchu was untouched by the Spanish. Apparently Francisco Pizarro had never been here, never tore it down and rebuilt it in his own image as he'd done in Cusco, never tried to erase the accomplishments of its builders, as he'd done across the empire. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Hiram likely thinks back on the tips sent to him by George Eastman, as he tries to include the others in photos to give a sense of scale. Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining. Hiram scrawls a crude map in his notebook. Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Now, I'd love to tell you that Hiram fully understood the true significance of what he found, that he praised God for his good fortune and planned how to tell the world of this archaeological gem tucked away in the mountains. But instead, Hiram just leaves. Many of the words he wrote about this day were written much later, and some of the pictures I've shown you aren't from this day at all. They're from 1912. Because on this day, July 24th, 1911, Hiram only spends a few hours at Machu Picchu. Instead, he heads back down the mountain and just continues on with his journey. But why? Why did he walk away? Was he blind? Was he just stupid? Could it have something to do with what he found written on a piece of stone? And more importantly, what was this place? That's a question he spent decades trying to unravel, because that history is the key to understanding Machu Picchu for Hiram and for us. This is Pachacutec, meaning the earth shaker, he who remakes the world, emperor of the Inca. Many consider him to be the greatest emperor of them all. Great-grandfather of Atahualpa, Pachacutec ruled in the early 1400s and is credited with the massive expansion of the Inca Empire. But to us, this may be his crowning achievement, Machu Picchu. It's believed he had it built to serve as a country estate, a religious center and mountaintop royal refuge from the stresses of life in Cusco. Nearly everything we know about this place comes from archaeology. The Inca left no written records of it, for a reason we'll get into. The site is made up of around 200 structures, most of them houses for the 750 or so people who lived here, much of them support staff for the emperor. Of course, the roofs are gone today, but this house gives you an idea of what they once looked like. And though the terraces are now covered in grass, they held crops like corn and potatoes. A complex drainage system directed the flow of water, and is the reason the terraces still stand today. The fertile soil on top was imported from other spots in the empire. The same held true for those who called this place home. We can tell from their remains that they came from all over the empire, moving here to maintain the site and see to the needs of the emperor. People making pottery and weaving cloth and growing food and so on. From what we can tell, they were well cared for. And as you wander amid these structures, one thing sticks out. Despite being built of so many massive blocks of stone, not a hint of mortar is used to hold them together. Every piece is ingeniously carved and locked into place, a technique that's allowed the site to stand up to earthquakes as the blocks shift and slide against one another. And these stones likely didn't have to travel far. Near the city sits a large quarry. Some of the rocks remain in a half-carved state. Among the notable structures here includes the Temple of the Sun, with its curved wall evoking the Coricancha in Cusco. Here, the Inca sun god Inti was worshipped. The shape of the wall likely allowed this to function as a solar observatory, tracking the sun as it changed position through the year. At a high point in the city sits the Intihuatana stone, meaning the hitching post of the sun. In a spiritual sense, the sun was tied here, ensuring that it would continue its cycle. And in a more practical sense, it was used as sort of a sundial, tracking the winter and summer solstices, indicating the best time to plant crops. There were once many stones like this throughout the empire. The Spanish destroyed the others. The sun and the sky were vital to life in the Inca Empire. These objects we call water mirrors were likely small reflecting pools, used to make astronomical observations. Nearby, one of the most striking structures at Machu Picchu, the Temple of the Condor. Partially consisting of existing stone, it was likely used for animal sacrifices. And here's one of the most well-known spots, especially to Hiram Bingham, partially because of what he found written on it. Called the Temple of the Three Windows. Some have theorized the windows relate to the three realms of the Inca religion: the celestial world above, the terrestrial world of the earth, and the underworld below. Right in the center of the city, what we call the Sacred Plaza, a large open space likely used for religious ceremonies. The clearing is hard to miss, which is probably why Hiram noted it on the very first map he drew. And rising above it all, the peak of Huayna Picchu, meaning New Peak. The name Machu Picchu means Old Peak. There's a few structures up on Huayna Picchu as well. And all around, right beneath your feet, a number of small tombs, similar to what we can see in this museum. They didn't just contain remains, but burial goods as well, which certainly plays a part later in this story. But you've probably noticed I keep using phrases like, "it's believed." That's because, as I said before, pretty much everything we know about this place comes from archaeology. You see, the Inca didn't have horses or cattle and had no use for the wheel. And they also had no formal written language. Instead, they had these, called quipus, knotted bundles of threads used to keep track of things like population and food storage. They may have contained other information as well, but we've yet to figure out how to decipher what they say. The Spanish destroyed nearly all of them, and the knowledge of how to read these pieces of the past was lost. So we don't have the words of those who lived here. All we have is the evidence they left behind, and what the surviving Inca told the Spanish or later wrote themselves about their lives and their culture. Certainly more than enough to know that Machu Picchu had nothing to do with aliens. This is simply one of the most majestic spots in the world, built by a group of highly intelligent and incredibly determined people. But their lack of words also means we aren't entirely sure where they went. Machu Picchu was built in the time of Pachacutec, but was only inhabited for less than 100 years. Its people just vanished. There's a few theories on why the city was abandoned. It's possible they fled because of the Spanish invasion, and it's also possible its people caught the diseases the Spanish brought with them and passed into history. But it's also possible they were forced to leave due to a lack of food. The crops grown here wouldn't have been enough to feed the population, meaning they would have relied on deliveries from other parts of the empire. Once it fell, the shipments stopped, making Machu Picchu uninhabitable. Regardless of why, it's likely the Spanish never found this place. Or if they did, they simply didn't think it was worth the trouble to come again. And so, Machu Picchu sat deserted for hundreds of years, until some local farmers decided to make it their home, and until an exhausted American scaled a mountain and showed up with a camera. As the Inca left Machu Picchu, so did Hiram Bingham. His day at the site would define his entire life, but he just wandered off and left it behind. Despite the breathless words he later used to describe this day, what he wrote at the time is mainly only recorded in a letter to his wife. It is far more wonderful and interesting than Choqquequirao. The stone is as fine as any in Cusco. It is unknown and will make for a fine story. I expect to return there shortly for a stay of a week or more. Hiram does send other team members to Machu Picchu later, but doesn't return himself on this trip at all. What's more, Harry Foot's diary only talks about collecting specimens and makes no mention of Machu Picchu, which certainly leads one to think Hiram just didn't say much of anything about it when he got back to camp. So why did Hiram walk away? Well, there's a few potential answers. It's possible he thought it just wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, much of it was obscured by plants, and it certainly wasn't as striking as it is today. It's also possible he just wanted to stick to the plan. At first glance, Hiram didn't believe Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, so any time he spent here was time he'd be taking away from that search. Or it could have something to do with what was written on the Temple of the Three Windows. You're gonna have to look closely because it's nearly impossible to make out. But written in charcoal were the words A. Lizarraga, 1902. Now, it's likely Hiram would have thought that farmers living at Machu Picchu didn't really count when it comes to discovery. They weren't Westerners like himself. But this, well, this could mean some other explorer had beaten him here. For a man looking to make a name for himself, that would more or less make Machu Picchu irrelevant. He asks Sergeant Carrasco who this guy is and is told he lives nearby. Hiram writes in his journal, Agustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu and lives at San Miguel Bridge. Hiram heads over to the bridge looking for Lizarraga and finds his brother. It turned out they were locals, meaning that to Hiram, they weren't competition and didn't count either. As for what happened to those words written in charcoal, well, we'll get back to that and you can decide for yourself what it says about Hiram. He heads on and makes his way towards an area known as Espiritu Pampa, meaning plain of ghosts. He finds a large white rock matching up with descriptions from clues he'd read about the town of Vitkos, the place where Manco lived before fleeing to nearby Vilcabamba. And sure enough, Hiram hacks his way through the jungle and finds some ruins. Harry Foot took this picture of him while they were there, and if you look closely, you can almost see Hiram's disappointment written all over his face. Frankly, he's devastated. The site was in poor condition and the stonework wasn't anywhere near as impressive as that at Machu Picchu. He decides this couldn't possibly be Vilcabamba, and as his supplies were running low, he leaves. And so he heads off to tackle the other items on his checklist, mainly climbing Mount Corupuna, which he accomplishes, even though it turned out not to be the highest mountain in South America. With that, the Yale scientific expedition to Peru comes to a close. All things considered, Hiram and his teams had done pretty well, and the trip was more or less a success. The only question was, which accomplishment would bring the most attention? It was just before Christmas when Hiram's ship arrived back in New York, the same place where the survivors of the Titanic would arrive just a few months later. Then before visiting his family, Hiram meets up with some reporters. The Sun now put him at the top of the front page with the title, White Temples of Lost City. It seems like Hiram told them about every aspect of the trip, but it's pretty clear which part of the journey they wanted to focus on. He calls Machu Picchu pre-Inca, though it certainly was Inca. And he's paraphrased here, but somewhat dismissively says, the corn growers seemed to know little about the temples around which they had planted their crops. They were of a different breed from the men who had built the temples and only had dim traditions concerning them. Hiram also gets some coverage in the Christian Science Monitor. And what he doesn't say, they do. The article talks of the City of Marble and basically says the Yale team is helping rewrite history. The whole scientific racism idea that the people of the Americas were primitive is getting tossed in the trash. It says the team is disproving the claim of the European that he was the first to spread the light of intelligence along these shores. But Hiram still doesn't seem to understand the gravity of what he'd found. He begins working on an article for Harper's Magazine focusing solely on climbing Mount Corupuna. Nevertheless, he is getting publicity here in New York and in other circles, though he's hardly become a celebrity. But one person takes notice, the son-in-law of Alexander Graham Bell, the man who invented the telephone. A guy named Gilbert Grosvenor, who's looking for someone just like Hiram. A guy who also happened to be the first full-time editor of National Geographic magazine. Yes, the National Geographic magazine. You see, Grosvenor had greatly expanded the magazine's popularity, due in large part to one thing, the use of photographs. something he knew Hiram had. So he invites Hiram to Washington, D.C. to give a speech that changes the course of his life. Because this started a partnership, one that involved National Geographic officially sponsoring Hiram on another trip to Peru. So it was back to the typewriter. Hiram talks about map making, but says to Grosvenor that you replied that you were not interested in that so much as you were in the ruins. They come to an agreement. The very lengthy name of this undertaking will be the Peruvian Expedition of 1912 under the auspices of Yale University and the National Geographic Society. Hiram gets a grant for 10 grand. That's around $350,000 in today's money. Yale puts up the same. In return, the magazine gets exclusive rights to an article. Of course, Hiram's still in charge, and he keeps talking about map making and botany and so on, but it's pretty clear what National Geographic wants. And let me tell you, Grosvenor is hyped. He tells Hiram, "I believe that this next expedition of yours is going to surpass your previous ones. We want all our members to be interested in the work because they are supporting it, and photographs will help it along immensely." Of course, Hiram's on board. He'd already written his friend George Eastman from Kodak thanking him and saying, "The photographic outfit which you supplied us worked splendidly." And he says the people who'd printed his pictures told me that ours was the best lot of negatives that they had seen. Clearly all the tips on taking pictures and developing them in the field had paid off. So Hiram hits up Eastman again, saying they're planning another expedition to Peru and says, "I hesitate to ask for any more favors." Eastman writes back and said he was delighted to hear everything worked out and says, "We can very likely let you have what you need." Hiram writes, "I am almost convinced that it would be extremely advisable to have one panorama Kodak in the outfit," which is just what it sounds like, a camera capable of taking panoramic photos. And Kodak is so pleased with the photos Hiram sent them, they actually use them in an exhibition. He ends up getting the panorama Kodak, as well as new cameras and new tripods and a ton of other equipment. Hiram also asks for flash powder, as he says he will likely be taking pictures in caves and dark interiors. It seems he has a bit of a plan for me. And all of these plans get some of the attention Hiram craved, in the New York Times, no less. In an article entitled, "Young Americans Seek to Erase Black Spots Off Map," Hiram is mentioned by name, and it says, "The eyes of the entire scientific world are perhaps more directed to this particular field than to any other in the world. But it soon wouldn't just be the scientific world, it would be the entire world, period." Hiram Bingham went back to Cusco once again, and while it certainly wasn't his only goal, the end result of this expedition would be nothing less than the resurrection of Machu Picchu itself. Of course, he had more money this time, which meant a larger team, and it also meant hiring some local workers. Hiram himself said they had to rely on securing forced labor from the government. And an engineer on his team said the governor of Ollantaytambo said that he would get as many Indians as I needed. I told him 12. Were these men paid? Well, yes. Did they want to be there? No, most certainly not. Whether it was on the rubber plantations or in the employment of a group from Yale, this was just another chapter in a long story where local people were pushed into working for foreigners. The workers' main task was clearing centuries of growth from Machu Picchu, and that's exactly what they did. Hiram was the chief photographer for this expedition, and he wanted to show the site as the Inca had left it, bringing back as many pictures for National Geographic as he could. But he also needed to keep Yale happy, something even Gilbert Grosvenor was aware of when he wrote, "We all hope that you will be able to excavate and bring back a shipload of antiquities for your museum at Yale." Like we talked about before, Hiram didn't really care about treasure, not in the traditional sense anyway. But he did care about artifacts, scientific treasure, museum treasure. So he set up kind of a reward system where he'd pay extra to workers who found tombs located in caves. And they found over 100 tombs, most fully intact, metal knives, elaborately decorated ceremonial jars, tiny sculptures of animals, and of course, bones. Most of the locals found all this work distasteful, as they saw it as grave robbing. But nevertheless, everything was packed up in crates and sent back to Yale, which would become a bit, let's just say, controversial. Now, Hiram himself wasn't there for much of this clearing and excavation. He was off in different parts of Peru looking for Vilcabamba and other ruins, as well as dealing with a few legal issues we'll get into. But everything here was happening under his direction, including the removal of Lizarraga's name. As Hiram himself later wrote, "We had spent 2 days of one workman's time in erasing from the beautiful granite walls the crude charcoal autographs of visiting Peruvians." There's still more to come on how much credit Hiram tried to take for everything, but it is worth pointing out that he did at least tell us something was erased. But I did say this expedition was about resurrection. Because regardless of what Hiram washed away, or what he had sent back to Yale, the real treasures here were the pictures and the stories he brought back with him. Machu Picchu was set free. The growth of centuries, as Hiram himself had called it, was gone. Thanks to the descendants of those who once lived here, its granite walls felt the warmth of the sun once again. This before and after comparison gives you an idea of the rebirth, which took place in what was once the home of an emperor. Grosvenor and everyone at the National Geographic offices were nothing short of elated. Hiram's pictures of the fully cleared site of Machu Picchu were beyond anything they could have imagined, and set off a firestorm of activity. And so it was that the special edition of National Geographic for the month of April in the year 1913 was published. There were no other articles, no other authors. The entire issue was dedicated solely to Hiram Bingham. And what's more, Grosvenor had greatly expanded the volume. It was basically a double issue. Under Grosvenor's guidance and suggestions on what readers would find most compelling, Hiram wrote every word himself. He explained a bit about the country of Peru and its cities and its people, making sure to include a few photos of llamas, as he tended to do. But the bulk of the issue focuses on Machu Picchu. Hiram explains how he first found the city and breaks down every section of the site, praising its beauty and ingenuity at every turn. Nearly every single page put Hiram's photos front and center, including quite a few taken with the special panoramic camera George Eastman gave him. In fact, Grosvenor spent extra to have one of the panoramic photos turned into a full-sized fold-out in the magazine. Of course, this wasn't a scientific paper. It's a magazine written for the public. And while much of what Bingham writes was later proven to be accurate, he also makes a few leaps of logic. For example, the water mirrors are shown, and Hiram says they were used to grind corn, which certainly isn't true based on the fact that they're far larger than what the Inca used for such a purpose. Hiram also puts forth the theory that Machu Picchu was actually Tampu Tocco, a mythical site where stories said the founders of the Inca Empire emerged from a cave before founding the city of Cusco. This story spoke of 3 windows at the site, and since Hiram found the Temple of the 3 Windows, he made a connection and ran with it. Later in life, he'd come to believe Machu Picchu was both Tampu Tocco and Vilcabamba. Neither of these beliefs were true, but at the time, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered in 1913 was that this issue of National Geographic took the world by storm. Grosvenor estimated that over 1 million people read the magazine. And I can't overemphasize how big of a deal this was. Over 10,000 words and featuring 250 pictures, Hiram Bingham became a household name. And the commotion wasn't just contained to those who read the magazine. Newspapers around the world sang the praises of Machu Picchu. The New York Times dedicated a full spread to the story entitled "Lost City in the Clouds, Found After Centuries." The very first sentence said, "Professor Hiram Bingham of Yale makes the greatest archaeological discovery of the age." It goes on to call him a member of the daredevil explorer's craft, and says he's turned other explorers green with envy. That poor son of Hawaiian missionaries wouldn't just be known as a footnote in the history of the Tiffany family. Through his hard work and persistence, Hiram Bingham was now a superstar. And Hiram himself was shocked by the response. He later said he didn't truly realize the importance of Machu Picchu until the world saw his photos. But there was one place where not everyone celebrated his name. Back in Peru, some came to see him as a criminal. Hiram Bingham was a murderer. Well, that's what some people in Peru thought anyway. Remember Lizarraga, the guy who wrote his name on the Temple of the Three Windows? In 1912, he was crossing a bridge and plunged into the river. Some began to whisper that the bridge's ropes were cut, and Hiram was the mastermind behind it. Now, this is almost certainly not true. Hiram wasn't even in Peru at the time. But this is just one example of how local people came to view foreigners stomping around their country. Many believed anyone digging around ruins was searching for gold, which is partially true. Treasure was the goal of excavation at Choqquequirao, and the tales of Vilcabamba were powered by stories of hidden Inca wealth. But the gold was gone. In fact, Francisco Pizarro sent so much gold back to Spain it nearly crashed their economy. And the only gold found at Machu Picchu was this single bracelet, uncovered long after Hiram was there. Nevertheless, rumors persisted. People believed Hiram was digging up all sorts of gold and silver and secretly sending it back to Yale, even using a steam shovel from the Panama Canal. Again, not true. But there was that matter of all those artifacts Hiram did take from Machu Picchu. Now, there was an old law stating that he needed approval to excavate. At the urging of Peru's president, Hiram had worked to get special permission from the government. Special permission that would give Yale exclusive rights to excavate and ship out anything he found. But in the midst of the big expedition in 1912, a change in government meant the whole thing fell apart. What Hiram did eventually get was an agreement to take objects out, as long as he sent them back later. And not everything was above board. In 1914, Hiram spent a huge amount of his own money to buy 366 Inca artifacts from a collector in Peru. That man had them smuggled out of the country and sent them to Yale. When Hiram went back to Peru on another expedition in 1915, some tried to shut him down. A newspaper in Cusco accused him of running a criminal excavation at Machu Picchu. Hiram writes in a letter, "Some of our enemies have been circulating some very malicious rumors in regard to the expedition which are most absurd in the extremities to which they have gone." In another, he says, "I am losing precious time and suffering a considerable amount of mental depression instead of being in the field doing my job." There was even a formal inquest at Hiram's office in Ollantaytambo where he had to open some crates in front of officials. A Yale graduate student working as Hiram's assistant writes about what happened as the man who'd been serving as sort of a prosecutor tries to prove his case. Little Cut-Up tried to make a lot of the unbroken pot, but was foiled by the director's appeal to the jury, which unanimously agreed on the first ballot that the pot would not bring 50 cents in Cusco. Now, I think it's fair to say that while some in Peru cared very much about the artifacts Hiram dug up, most were of the belief that if he wasn't actually shipping out gold, who cares? Hiram had won the day, but officially, the investigation continued. Hiram felt utterly defeated. He canceled the rest of his work, went to Machu Picchu for one final visit, and got the assistance of some British friends to help him get out of the country, feeling he'd never return again. As for the objects Hiram had sent home, he spoke of some of them in a letter to Gilbert Grosvenor. "They do not belong to us, but to the Peruvian government, who allowed us to take them out of the country on condition that they be returned in 18 months. He goes on to say, "The matter has assumed a very large importance in the eyes of the Peruvians, who feel that we are trying to rob their country of its treasures." Grosvenor agrees, saying, "I feel that we ought to abide by the letter of our agreement with the Peruvian government and return all of the material that we contracted to return, and I am glad you share this view with me." In 1920, Peru asked for some of the objects back. Yale asked Peru for an extension until 1922, and they agreed. Yale sent back a few items, but Peru said they were worthless. 1922 came and went. The rest of the 20th century came and went, and the objects stayed with Yale. And this is all a very old chapter in the even older book of colonialism. Museums around the world are full of items Westerners took, some of which remain hotly disputed to this very day. As for Hiram, I think he was doing what he thought was right. He wanted his findings studied and kept safe. Sure, he'd skirted the law and bought objects which were smuggled out. But he could make the argument that if it was possible for someone to buy and sell artifacts and smuggle them out to another country, then that alone was proof that they wouldn't be studied and wouldn't be safe. But in the 21st century, Peru began pushing for Yale to send the Machu Picchu artifacts home. An agreement where the objects would be shared fell apart, and in 2008, Peru sued in U.S. federal court. Yale tried to get the case dismissed, saying there was no reason to file it in Washington, D.C. And in 2010, the president of Peru asked Hiram's fellow Hawaii alumnus, President Barack Obama, to intervene. In an issue of the Yale Daily News, sitting above a cartoon showing Indiana Jones at Machu Picchu clutching a jar, an opinion column urges the university to return the items to Peru, referring to a letter signed by a number of Yale alumni, asking for the same thing. And in Lima, protesters marched through the streets demanding the artifacts come back to Peru. Of course, we live in a world full of murky old laws and international disputes. We live in a world where artifacts are rarely returned to where they came from. But there are exceptions. You see, I took the pictures of these artifacts myself, and I didn't take them at Yale. I took them at a museum dedicated to Machu Picchu, right in the middle of Cusco.
Arqueológicas de Machu Picchu, devueltas por la Universidad de Yale.
Because in 2010, the artifacts were sent home. Peru thanked Yale, acknowledging that the university had taken good care of them, and they might otherwise have been lost. Most of the items were back in Peru by 2011, 100 years after Hiram Bingham first set foot in Machu Picchu. And Yale actually paid for the shipments themselves. Now, this agreement only applied to what Hiram excavated from Machu Picchu. According to an article in the Yale Daily News, the university does not have to return a number of pieces Bingham bought from traders while in Peru. But there's no doubt the outcome was a huge victory for the country. They got everything they asked for and filled an entire museum with the relics of their past, not too far from where a statue of the founder of Machu Picchu, Pachacutec himself, overlooks the main square of Cusco. A happy ending for that city in the clouds. But would Hiram be able to achieve the same outcome? Last we saw, he was heading back north on a steamship, feeling like an outcast. Hiram returned home from Peru and tried to settle back into life, rejected and dejected. He resumed teaching Latin American history at Yale while trying to fend off criticisms from Peru. While surprises still awaited him, for all intents and purposes, his career as an explorer was over. He tried to write another article for National Geographic, but his heart just wasn't in it. Grosvenor said his first draft was too long and repetitive and full of bad writing. The headlines had moved on to something else. World War I was raging in Europe, and Hiram felt compelled to get ready. To him, the involvement of the United States seemed inevitable. And Hiram Bingham reinvented himself yet again. He became a pilot. Aviation was still a relatively new invention, and he quickly developed a deep love of flying, a direction that makes sense, considering we're talking about a guy who always dreamed of making a name for himself. Of course, Hiram was too old and too tall and probably a bit too famous for actual combat, but he was organizing ground schools for pilot training. And when the U.S. entered the war, Lieutenant Colonel Hiram Bingham left his large family once again, setting off for France, eventually commanding the Allies' largest air school and leading 8,000 men. But with the war's end, Hiram was rudderless once more. He worked on some books about his travels before setting off on yet another new path: politics. He was elected Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut, thanks at least in part to a bit of a friendship with Teddy Roosevelt. Next, he ran for governor in 1926 and won, but only served for a single day. That's because a vacancy had led to yet another nomination in the race for U.S. Senator, which he also won. While in Washington, he advocated for new types of aviation and became known as the Flying Senator for stunts like landing a blimp at the Capitol and even riding in what's known as an autogyro, sort of a precursor to the helicopter. And we can even see him in a ceremony celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, next to Orville Wright and Amelia Earhart herself. And it was during his time as a senator that he met and fell in love with the wife of a congressman. Hiram served in office until 1933. The two carried on an affair for years. Eventually, he and Alfreda got divorced. She never really fit in with the lifestyle of politics, though you'd have to think all the time Hiram spent away from her in South America didn't help. He married his mistress, and Alfreda herself was remarried soon after. He grew older, spending his time working on books and giving lectures, likely looking back on the loose threads of his life, wondering what he'd left behind when he was forced to leave Peru. After all, we know Machu Picchu certainly wasn't Vilcabamba, that city he was so focused on finding. But the thing is, Hiram actually did find Vilcabamba. It was that very same spot he'd left in disappointment, hastily constructed by Manco and the remnants of the Inca Empire. Of course, there was no hidden Inca gold, but Hiram Bingham did find what he was searching for. He just didn't know it. In the end, even the city he failed to recognize became part of his legacy. But as Hiram wrote and reflected on his life, we must do the same. I did say we'd put him on trial, and I suppose you can render your own verdict in the comments. Some look at him through a magnifying glass and say he was indeed a con man and a charlatan, someone who claimed to discover a site the locals already knew about. But Hiram never really made that claim. The story he told is, more or less, what happened. Thanks to Melchor Arteaga and George Eastman and Gilbert Grosvenor and Augustin Lizarraga and so many others who helped him along the way, the masses gave Hiram credit as a man who found Machu Picchu and showed it to the world, which is what he did. For a definitive answer to these questions, let's look to Hiram's own words in a letter he wrote to his old school in Hawaii. I suppose that in the same sense of the word as it is used in the expression, Columbus discovered America, it is fair to say that I discovered Machu Picchu. Columbus didn't discover anything, and Hiram certainly knew that. Others were already living in the Americas, and Europeans had already been there. He's just the one who made the knowledge widespread. As for the accusation of Hiram being a racist, well, he was, but in a way, he turned out to be the opposite. He was raised by those who thought it was their duty to convert the backwards natives of Hawaii, erasing their outdated traditions. Hiram later focused on the Spanish colonizers and didn't think the natives of South America had much to offer his studies, or the world itself. And while Hiram wasn't a trained scientist, he certainly did follow a scientific mindset. He was willing to change his beliefs when presented with new information, and that's what he did. Let's look again to his own words at the very beginning of his final book. Few people realize how much they owe to the ancient Peruvians. Their civilization, which took thousands of years to develop, was marked by inventive genius, artistic ability, and a knowledge of agriculture which has never been surpassed. But while he gained a sense of awe for those ancient Peruvians, the modern ones came to feel the opposite. Hiram felt like they'd forced him to flee, and he left Peru in the past. For all the hats he tried to wear, professor, pilot, politician, nothing ever lived in him the way the Inca once did. But eventually, things changed. Over time, his old Peruvian colleagues began getting back in touch. Even the man who'd called Hiram's excavations criminal and led an investigation against him gained a sense of appreciation. He'd read Hiram's books and even came to visit him at his home. And the best way for us to end this tale of discovery is with rediscovery. Because in 1948, the same year Hiram published his final book, Lost City of the Incas, Peru itself reached out in friendship. You see, they'd built a new road, one leading up that same mountain Hiram had climbed those many years ago. The same road millions of tourists and their cameras now ride along in buses on their own trips to Machu Picchu, a site now hailed as one of the 7 new wonders of the world. Hiram Bingham went back to Peru one last time. He declined a plane ride from Lima to Cusco, choosing to take a train, just as he did in his youth. And he didn't take a car up the mountain either. Hiram and his wife rode mules, just for old time's sake. At the top, over 30 years since he'd last visited Machu Picchu, Hiram was now the guest of honor. That new road was named after him, the Carretera Hiram Bingham. The spot was marked with a plaque, acknowledging him as the scientific discoverer of Machu Picchu. In a speech, Hiram said it was one of the most grateful moments of his entire life. And so, as the camera rolled silently, Hiram Bingham set foot on the grounds of Pachacutec one last time, surely thinking back on that day in 1911 and everything that brought him to that moment. He later added a paragraph to his final book, noting what he called these several happy days. That book went on to be a bestseller, and it was his final trip to Peru. Hiram Bingham later passed away in Washington, D.C. at the age of 80. He was buried with honors in Arlington National Cemetery. But in a flawed life full of victories and defeats, perhaps his greatest victory was that those Roman numerals no longer hang from his neck. He's not remembered as Hiram Bingham III. He's simply the Hiram Bingham, explorer. If you like this video, maybe check out this one I made on another explorer who tore apart one of the most spectacular tombs in Egypt.